President Putin and his leadership were understandably very focused on Ukraine. And being so focused on Ukraine, I think they took their eye off the ball in the Caucasus. They weren't watching carefully what Mr. Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, was up to. I don't think they really worried about it because Aliyev's father, who was a KGB major general, a member of the Politburo, and was viewed as absolutely loyal to both the Soviet Union and subsequently Russia, suggested there was nothing to worry about in Azerbaijan. Well, that's turned out to be wrong. The Azeris have formed a very close relationship with Israel, and that relationship also includes Greater Turkey, in other words, Mr. Erdogan. But primarily Israel and Erdogan and the United States all share a similar interest right now in Azerbaijan. That is to destabilize and harm Iran in any way possible. Well, what's the worst thing that could happen to Iran? Well, the worst thing that could happen to Iran is for the Iranian country, the nation itself, to break up. And we know for a very long time that Iran has had various pockets of nationalities, though well integrated and part of the Iranian national state and society, they nevertheless still exist. And that includes the Azeri-Turkic population in northwestern Iran. There is now a definite, deliberate, conscious plan to invade northern Iran by Azerbaijan in the hopes of raising a rebellion in northwestern Iran centered around Tabriz, which is the center of the Turkic population in northwestern Iran. There are lots of Azeris in Iran who are currently interested in this. So the threat to Iran is very real. That's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that Azerbaijan was already offering or providing a platform for use by the Mossad, MI6, and CIA against Iran. We're not sure how much was used. In other words, did they launch drones? Probably. But they certainly moved agents from Azerbaijan into Iran, which were then able to set up and cause havoc inside Iran during the 12-day war. This is part of the problem. And then you have to look further to the west at Syria, understand that Syria is basically part of Greater Turkey. Everything that happens in Syria happens because Mr. Erdogan wants it to or doesn't want it to. Jolani is not an independent agent. He is a figurehead. And Erdogan, for the moment, wants to get along with the Jewish state. However, there are limitations to his cooperation.
And I'm sorry, Doug, Jelani is a figurehead, and who's pulling his strings?
Erdogan. Jelani is just a figurehead in Syria that we, the Israelis, MI6, in other words, US CIA, and Erdogan installed. So Erdogan was always interested in dislodging Assad, but for reasons that were different from the Israelis. The Israelis are now in southern Iran, and they intend to stay there, or so they say. This is a permanent point of friction with Turkey. The Turks would like to see the Russians leave, but they don't want a confrontation with the Russians. But they would like to control what today we call northern Lebanon, as well as this enclave of Syria that touches the Mediterranean. So the Turks have certain goals in the region. The Israelis have their own greater Israel goals. Azerbaijan wants to create greater Azerbaijan as part of a greater Turkic enclave or confederation, if you will, with the hope of eventually exercising some degree of hegemony over the region. Then you have Iran to the south of Azerbaijan that is preparing for another round in the war. I think they expect the war to restart probably in September. It will take that long for radars, missiles, munitions, and other things to find their way to Israel. So they're preparing for the next round of war. And at the same time, they're looking at this probable invasion from Azerbaijan, which they probably expect to coincide with an Israeli resumption of the war against them. Now, if you're sitting in Moscow and you realize all of these things have happened, it's unraveling to some extent Moscow's southern security area. In other words, Azerbaijan was seen as a component of Russian security strategy, as a friend, as someone that would be a force for stability. Azerbaijan has turned out to be the opposite. So the Russians are going, I think, to accelerate the end of the war in Ukraine. That may mean more devastation and death inside Ukraine, simply because no one will step forward in Europe or Ukraine to negotiate an end. But this incentivizes the Russians to move quickly, and when I say quickly, within weeks, to terminate what's happening in Ukraine. They need now to focus on the Caucasus. They don't want to become embroiled in a war in the Caucasus, but they can't stand by and watch this destabilizing influence that the Israeli, Azerbaijani, and American access is creating, because they can't allow Iran to simply be broken up. Now, keep in mind, Iran's not going to sit there quietly and allow the northwestern part of its country to be cut off and incorporated into Azerbaijan either. But these are all now connected. Everything that we're discussing is connected. And the Russians have a very powerful ground force, as you know, very powerful missile force. I think their armed forces, if you had to pick a time for them to operate and fight, is probably now better than ever. But when you put all of what I just discussed together, you get the rationale for what President Putin is saying. He's saying, look, we are at war. We are being attacked on multiple sides. We have to prepare for this. We have to be prepared to act decisively to win.
And it could well be that. In fact, I have one more soundbite from that speech, which would seem to taper in pretty nicely to what you just said, because he's here talking about the external aggression.
And when our country, our people faced a direct threat, increasing external aggression, new punitive operations against the residents of Donbass and Novorossiya, the People's Front undertook the very work, the very mission that it was obliged to undertake, because the People's Front is a part of our people. Starting in February 2022, you have deployed and provided worldwide support to our heroes on the front lines, to the defenders of the motherland, their families, the armed forces, the defense industry, everyone who fulfills their patriotic human duty.
And he went on there to specifically talk about, I want to completely mobilize the whole population. Sewing battalions, private firms have been helping with drones, volunteering, vehicles, household items, etc. $2 billion, he says, has been destroyed Western kit has been destroyed by these people, whatever. He goes on there to just really emphasize a lot of detail about how he's trying to incorporate everybody in there. And you're suggesting that this may all be timed now. And because that's the question, why at 3.5 years would you be doing this when it seems like, in one hand, that maybe the Ukraine side is basically, with those casualties, you can't sustain that too much longer, I wouldn't think. But now then this is going up. So you expect that this could be rather a precursor to an increased combat operation in Ukraine?
I think so, but I think it's also a message to us, Dan. He's not just signaling the Russian people that this is coming. There are many, many Russians that have said this should have happened 2-3 years ago. So I think that may not make everyone thrilled, but they understand what's happening. They understand the threats on all sides, the threats from the Caucasus, the threats from Eastern Europe. This is not new in Russian history. If you go back to the czars, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, I would say certainly up until the 1860s, the Russians were engaged militarily almost as frequently in the Caucasus and southern Russia as they were in Eastern Europe. They had problems on both ends. So this is not new, and I think they're prepared to handle it. But I think the message is being sent to us. You need to understand something, Washington. We know what you're doing. We understand the relationship between you, the Israelis, Erdogan, and Aliyev. In other words, Turkey and Azerbaijan. We understand that you want to destroy the unity, the integral state of Iran, because you also want to destroy the One Belt, One Road. You want to destroy the commercial and economic infrastructure that Russia and China are trying to build in Central Asia. You are trying to isolate us. I mean, that's really his message. And he's saying it's not going to work because we will fight. Now, there's a problem here, and that's us. Are we prepared to really fight a major war? He knows we're not. And all he has to do is look at the economy. And before we're through, we should touch on the financial system and the economy and the impact of the big, beautiful bill, among other things.
Well, that's a perfect transition, because that's exactly where I'd like for us to go, and that is on the financial issue in BRICS. So, Gary, a little bit out of order here. If you can put up that full screen that last night Trump put on Truth Social, a warning and a threat. Any country aligning themselves with the anti-American policies of BRICS will be charged an additional 10% tariff. There will be no exceptions to this policy. And then that weird thing, thank you for your attention to this matter. BRICS is not responding well to it. There was some comment this morning where they issued some warnings of their own, trying to not antagonize Trump and didn't go directly to it. But the aggravation is quite clear. Now, for those who may not know, and obviously you do, but for our audience here, I want to show them, because a lot of times when people hear this term BRICS, they don't know what it means, or they think it's just some small thing. Not so much. Look at how much BRICS has actually expanded just in the last few years.
BRICS was founded in 2009 by Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And in 2010, South Africa joined. And in 2024, BRICS added 5 new full members, which are Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. And in 2025, BRICS added 10 partner states, which are on the path to full membership in the near future. Those countries are Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, Uzbekistan, and Vietnam. Together, these 10 members and 10 partners represent the BRICS 20, often referred to as BRICS Plus. And together, the BRICS 20 make up more than 2/5 of the global economy. BRICS Plus is 44% of global gross domestic product, GDP, when you measure it at purchasing power parity, PPP. 44%, over 2/5 of the world economy.
Okay, and that's a snapshot as of right now. BRICS is meeting right now in Rio de Janeiro, and they're again trying to expand their market share. More on that in just a second. But now then, let's look at what may be coming next. You mentioned the big beautiful bill, and obviously there's lots of diversity on whether that's going to be a disaster, a catastrophe, or a big beautiful thing. You can talk on that in a minute. But no matter whose version you look at, it's going to add huge amounts of debt onto an already huge burden on top of us. Now, how do you see all that playing out in terms of what the BRICS is doing with the U.S. system?
Well, remember that BRICS is the alternative to the U.S.-dominated financial system, which we created in the aftermath of the Second World War. We effectively stepped into the shoes of the British Empire. And then what emerged was the Anglo-American financial empire. In other words, we decided that we would create a system that would reward people for cooperating with us and giving us advantageous arrangements for trade, provided they used our dollar and slipped into this new Bretton Woods style financial system that effectively subordinated everybody's interest to our interest. Now, remember that for most people at the end of the Second World War, who were in poverty, who were in ruins, frankly, or were very, very behind in terms of economic development, it made sense to cooperate with us. But over time, this financial system has been employed as a means of bullying countries into submission. And we need to understand something. When we mention the dollar, we're talking about effectively a network where you use the dollar, you go through the SWIFT system, you settle all your accounts and debts with a dollar. And of course, you enter into what effectively is what we accuse the Chinese of, which is debt slavery. We accuse them of debt slavery. We're the ones that have been enslaving the world with debt through this dollar network. How do you get out from under the dollar network? Well, first of all, you end up with gold as a reserve currency, which is, as Nassim Taleb points out, is increasingly a fact. And then secondly, you stop using dollars to the extent that you're able. Now, how do you do that? Well, you have to go to another system. What's the other system? BRICS. And they have this thing that the Chinese have helped develop called CIPS, which is the alternative to the SWIFT system, which is very modern, digital, and settles business across national lines. Why is all of this significant? Well, people are frankly sick of us because as time wore on, we weren't satisfied to bully people with financial means. We decided that we'd threaten them militarily if they did not do what we wanted. You own assets in a place like Senegal that has gold mines and produces 20% of its economy produces gold. And let us say that Senegal is in debt to the United States, to France, to Britain, to the Western financial system, and has been using dollars. And suddenly the people in Senegal said, well, we'll never get out from underneath this terrible debt that has been inflicted on us. They turned then to BRICS. And what does BRICS say? Forget that debt. Nationalize your assets, join us, and you can tell the West to fly a kite. Well, that's effectively where we're headed right now. In other words, the alternative network, the alternative to the dollar network, to the financial system we built, is emerging. It's emerging very quickly. It's far stronger, far more resilient, more modern in the case of SIPs, for instance, than SWIFT. And it's come online long before anybody thought it was possible. If you had told people 10 years ago that within 10 years, an alternative to the dollar-denominated financial system run by the United States and the Anglo-American financial empire would come along that quickly, everybody would say, well, that's impossible. These things take decades to build. Well, it's turned out that it's there. It's very real. So de-dollarization now is ongoing. So if you look at Iran and China, for instance, they do all of their business in their own currency. End of discussion. That is going to become the standard around the world. The map that you showed is very important because it doesn't take a genius to figure out that, gosh, that's most of the world.
Yeah.
That's most of the world's population. And you talked about 40, 44, 45% of global GDP. Well, where are we in terms of global GDP? We've fallen below 23%. You know, the time after World War II, we constitute almost 50% of it. The old order is dying.